So again, it's looking into the first 6 years of phase 3, starting in 2013. And I guess some of the industries we have particularly looked at, so cement, the first category, and so what I wanted to show with cement is that their emissions are actually increasing. So that's quite worrying, because we're definitely looking in Europe to a net zero by 2050 scenario, which means that measures will have to be taken. We're seeing a drop in steel emissions, but we know that that's not necessarily the EU ETS, but rather the global oversupply, and that impacting on production levels in Europe. So actually, the image is pretty bleak from the perspective of a climate policy think tank. The current state of affairs won't get us to net zero. And so if we go to the next slide, we see a bit the different trajectories that we're on. The part in blue is the real level of emissions, and the gray line at the very top is just the ETS cap. So when I started the presentation, I referred to this disconnect between where the cap is and where the emissions are. And so what this disconnect means is that the cap, although it should be the element driving down the emissions, is actually not necessarily able to do that. And if we were to draw a trajectory from where we are today to 2050, we also notice that it's got nothing to do with the current trajectory of the cap. So clearly, more has to be done to support industrial decarbonization if we are serious about reaching net zero by 2050. And so, as Robert also mentioned, the EU Commission has, under the notion of the EU Green Deal, tried to answer the question of, what would be the relevant policies to effectively make up for the lack of relevance of the EU ETS for these sectors. Now, before we talk about the EU Commission, we've also asked ourselves the same question, and we actually ran a call for evidence. So we can go to the next slide. We've ran 2 calls for evidence because we wanted to hear. Oh, sorry, it's the slide after that. Yes. So we wanted to hear from industry. We wanted to engage with industrial stakeholders and have a chance to hear what they thought was needed to actually address the issues we're faced with in the EU. So the first call for evidence ran from February to April 2018, and it resulted in our Barriers to Industrial Decarbonization report, which we released in the European Parliament in May 2018. And now, more recently, from October 2019 to just last month, we had another call for evidence, and we will be launching a report whenever the European Parliament is open to visitors again. The next report will be called Europe's Moonshot to Zero Carbon Industry. We've received over 30 different responses from industrial stakeholders, and we've really learned very much from them. We also had a chance to have and run interviews. So I think the next proposals, the next suggestions that I will make are based on this evidence that we collected in terms of the problems highlighted and what we think would actually help industry to move ahead. So I'm sorry to say we now have to go to the previous slide, which I hope is not too confusing. Okay. So we grouped the different approaches that industry suggested in order to highlight where the issues were. And we found issues for each of these 3 categories. I think I'm sure for the audience, this won't necessarily be very new, but we tried to find ways to actually suggest policies that make sense to industrial stakeholders. It's very easy for us as climate NGOs sometimes to say, just we need net zero and we need to start doing it right now. But just understanding the different elements of it is what we consider to be most important. So I think right now, in terms of electrification, that is an interesting perspective for us from the EU ETS side. Given that industry in Europe receives free allocation for a lot of its emissions, electrifying it would actually change a bit that balance, because effectively under the EU ETS cap, you'd have a transfer of emissions. So that would be a very interesting approach to take. So massive electrification, but of course, taking, let's say, just one industry, so maybe an industry like the paper industry in Europe, electrifying that on a massive scale would actually be the equivalent of adding the UK to the continental electricity grid. So we know that that's not going to be possible entirely.
5 minutes,
so then,
if we can, please.
Sorry?
5 minutes to go.
Yes. So material substitution is another area of policies we've looked into, with a particular interest in the iron and steel sector. We did a bit of work and realized that, let's say, substitutes such as pellets being used would have a pretty significant reduction will lead to a significant reduction already by 2030. So a combination of policies to electrify and to encourage material substitution would be a good combination, as well as anything having to do with encouraging material efficiency. So those two examples are just kind of the answers we received. But ultimately for us, just the disclosure of carbon along the value chain and more visibility of process emissions would probably give us enough instruments for material efficiency. But right now we don't have that. Okay. So the next slide is with our key findings from both of the calls, the calls for evidence. We found that the EU ETS has an unfortunate effect of locking in innovation by the benchmarks that it uses to grant free allocation. So several of our respondents indicated that there's no real incentive for the benchmark to be lowered because of the impact that would have on free allocation. So we are proposing to actually gradually move away from the whole benchmark free allocation system and with a view to net zero, and to slowly start introducing a border carbon adjustment. So I'm curious how I would be curious to hear how the audience in Adelaide perceives that. And I'm sorry not to have a chance to do so in person, but hopefully maybe through follow-ups. Okay, so the issue with substitutes is that the substitutes are not included in the benchmarks. So even when we have low carbon solutions available, because they're not part of the benchmark, they're effectively at a disadvantage on the market. I'll skip over point 3 because the underperformance of the EU ETS, I've talked about it quite a lot. Now, looking ahead, there's an innovation fund in the EU ETS, but unfortunately, it's still tied to these benchmarks that I explained have not necessarily always a positive effect on innovation. So unless we're aiming for some sort of a net zero indicator in the innovation fund, there's a possibility that this as well will not necessarily give us the innovation that we need. Now, we didn't used to have a clear framework for green hydrogen, but that's been addressed recently by the European Commission's proposal, the EU industrial strategy that came out last week. And there's a lack of support for CCS in the society, as well as in some policymaking circles. So these were the issues. And if we move on, I think, that's just an excerpt of from our BCA report. So border carbon adjustments, how would they work? We're trying to see how they could work alongside the EU ETS already in the next decade. So we have proposed a way of phasing in a border carbon adjustment while phasing out the free allocation system in Europe. We'll have to see whether that becomes included in the EU's policy toolbox. But for now, it's been mentioned in the industrial strategy, so we're quite happy with that. Okay, next slide just briefly talks about the elements of the industrial strategy launched last week. The first one is that there's a big emphasis on the digital transition and how this will help industrial decarbonization. But of course, for us as a climate NGO, we don't necessarily agree with the underlying logic in the document, which sort of goes to say that the ecological and the digital transitions are twin transitions. We don't see very much. We don't see that twinning to be very accurate. In any case, the strategy does have a very good focus on the time up to 2030, which we think is crucial in shifting the investment and, of course, giving the right framework to plan ahead. It introduces a hydrogen alliance, again, very positive development, as well as it recommends introducing sector-specific measures. So there will be a separate proposal for the steel sector, for the chemical sector, for plastics in Europe. So loads of additional policies, but probably that makes a lot of sense because not all sectors have the same challenges. And so this is something we're currently endorsing.
1 minute
There's
to go.
Strong focus on material circularity and a mention of the BCA. So I'm happy to perhaps stop here because just the next slides would have been more about the EU ETS, but I think I've already covered the points in the next slides in the presentation while we were preparing the slide pack. So.
Thank you very much, Suzana, and striking for me in your point that you're saying there are big challenges in making an ETS work in industry which have not yet been talked about publicly. Can I ask everybody here to thank Suzana on